Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to this meeting of the Dunedin City Council. Welcome to councillors, to staff, to the media and especially to those of you from the community. Our opening today will be a prayer from the Reverend Brendan McRae from Flagstaff Presbyterian Community Church. Welcome, Brendan.
Mihi, Your Worship. Kia ora tātou. Let's begin with karakia. I te atua tō mātou kaihanga, God our Creator. When you speak, there is light and life. When you act, there is justice and aruha. Grant that your aruha may be present in our hui. Eternal God, source of all wisdom, we ask you to bless the representatives we have elected. Grant that through their discussions and decisions we may solve our problems effectively. Enhance the well-being of our city, Ōtepoti Dunedin, and Te Rai Te Uru, our province of Otago, and achieve together a fairer and more united community. And God of the Southern Sea, and of these lands of Māori and Pakeha, and of all who dwell in our whenua. As we listen and discuss the concerns of our earth, our climate, may we listen deeply to Papa Tuanuku, Mother Earth. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. Teach us to understand that we are sisters and brothers with all of creation. And pour out upon us the power of your love that we may protect life and beauty. And so God, in our meeting today, as we conduct the matters of business, guide our hearts and our minds in the spirit of fairness, right thought and speech. May we honour one another by keeping an open mind. May we voice our truth and listen with an open heart. And may we discern your will to unite in fruitful outcome. We ask for your wisdom and grace to use our talents for the betterment of others. With gratitude, we offer this karakia in your name. Honour and glory to God, peace on earth, goodwill to all people. He honore, he kororia ki te atua. He mau nā runga ki te whenua, he whakaaro pai ki nā tangata katoa. Amen.
Amen. Now move on to apologies. I'll move from the chair that we accept the apology from Councillor Staines, seconded Councillor Wiley. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. I'll further move that confirmation of the agenda. I move that Council confirms the agenda with the following alterations in regard to Standing Order 2.1. Option C be adopted in relation to moving and seconding and speaking to amendments. Seconded Councillor Wilson. All those in favour please say aye. Against? Carried. Item 5, declarations of interest. I'll move that, are there any changes to that? So if there are none, then I'll move that Council notes the elected members' interest register, attachment A, confirms the proposed management plan for elected members' interests and notes the executive leadership team interest register, attachment B. Second to Councillor Wilson. Any discussion? I'll put it. All those in favour please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Now on to item 6, confirmation of minutes. I'll move that the Council confirms the public part of the minutes of the Ordinary Council meeting of 30th of April 2019 is a correct record. Second to Councillor Wilson. Any discussion on that? I'll put it. All those in favour please say aye. Against? Carried. Item 6.2, I'll move that Council confirms the public part of the minutes of the Ordinary Council meeting of 28th May as a correct record. Second to Councillor Gary. All those any discussion? All those in favour please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. And I'll move 6.3 that Council confirms the minutes of the Ordinary Council annual plan deliberations meeting of 29th, 30th and 31st of May as a correct record. Seconded Councillor Hall. Any discussion? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Item 7, minutes of committees. Item 7, Finance and Council-controlled organisations. Councillor Lord.
I'd just like to move that Council notes the meeting of the Finance and Council-controlled organisation committee held on the 21st of May.
Seconded Councillor Elder. Hall. Councillor Hall. Any discussion? Put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Economic Development Committee meeting. Councillor Wiley.
I move that Council notes the minutes of the Economic Development Committee meeting held on the 21st of May 2019 and takes part C items of the minutes.
Seconded Councillor Gary. Any discussion? Put it. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Community and Culture. Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, Tanaka, Your Worship. And before I do that, I'd just like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the passing of Shona Dunlop McTavish last week at the age of 99, the mother of modern dance in this country, and a woman whose legacy as a practitioner and a teacher and a choreographer lasted the duration of her life and will continue to say nothing of her role as the matriarch of a family that for 3 generations have been leaders in our community and our environment, our political life and our arts community. When I put in, her life is currently being celebrated at Knox Church across town. I put in my apologies for the service that said we had a climate emergency declaration to debate around the table, and I was reliably informed that Shona would approve of that as a reason for missing such a function. So I just wanted to take that opportunity to note that. I'll now move that Council note the minutes of the Community and Culture meeting held on the 11th of June 2019.
Seconded Councillor Laufiso. Discussion? I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Community boards. There's only 2 this time, Councillor Wiley, but we'll have a package again.
Thank you, Worship. That the Council notes the minutes of the Waikowai Coast Community Board meeting held on the 13th of March and notes the minutes of the Otago Peninsula Community Board meeting held on the 2nd of May 2019.
Seconded Councillor O'Malley. Any discussion? Put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. On to reports. Number 12, adoption of the annual plan. Can I invite Ms Graham and Mr Logie up to speak to this? Welcome. Do you wish to introduce this in any way?
We're happy to take questions.
That's right. So are there any questions, councillors? Councillor Vandevers.
Since this plan was first proposed, and only just in the last few days, we've had a statement of intent information, which I believe has come late, but has confirmed very significant increases in budgeted debt. In the case of the DCC, it looks very much like an extra, probably $30 million. And if we look at group debt, for which we're all liable, the budget for the next 3 years is for this debt to go up by $100 million every single year for the next 3 years. Do we need to go through a special consultative procedure, given that the figures we now have in front of us are so different to the ones that were included in this particular plan?
So, Councillor, just I can comment on obviously on the DCC portion of the debt. If I refer members to page 95 of the supplementary papers, or it's actually probably the papers, obviously the debt's been driven by the fact that we've brought forward a significant amount of capital expenditure, which has been discussed through the various forums during the annual plan deliberations. So that's primarily the reason why our debt's going up. Instead of going up by $23 million, it's going up by $43 million. So it's a reflection of bringing forward to those projects, plus the additional expenditure that we discussed at the deliberations around the Peninsula project.
So to answer the question, given that there is such a significant increase, what level of increase would trigger the need for a special consultative procedure?
We're still within the limits set by the financial strategy. What level would trigger an SCP? I'm not sure. But given that this is what's proposed within the annual plan, is within the limits of our strategy, this plan does not trigger the need for an SCP.
Does the recent, even worse news from the Dunedin City Holdings Limited accounts, the new SOIs that have just come out, showing that they will lose $24 million in the next couple of years, and that their budgeted debt increase goes up by $100 million each year. Does that have any impact, apart obviously from S&P, looking at our overall cost of debt? Does the new information from the companies which we've just received, does that in any way impact on our decision to authorise this plan today?
No.
Thank you.
Any further questions, councillors? Councillor O'Malley, sorry to have you down.
That's all right, Your Worship. So I just want to clarify then, the movement of activities forward into the annual plan have come from activities that were budgeted in the long-term plan, which was consulted on. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
No further questions, councillors? Councillor Lord.
Yeah, look, could I just have clarity? So Councillor Van Divers has just referred to the increase in the DCHL loss, but what was the signal figure in January when we originally saw the statements of intent? Do you remember the figures at that time?
Sorry, I can't comment on the statement of intent. So, that's probably a discussion to have during this statement of intent discussion.
Councillor Wilson.
Just again for clarification, if we've moved everything, we've moved the substantial number of items to earlier, as Councillor O'Malley has just talked about and you answered in your earlier response. Given criticism of the New Zealand Government for not spending more while interest rates are low and fixing those rates, are there some potential gains or decreasing of risk to the community by us doing this work earlier at a relatively low interest rate period?
I think the plan, I mean, we had a number of discussions during the deliberations, and really this is just a reflection of those deliberations. We had discussions then around the need to get on and deliver some of this stuff, and I think we've probably demonstrated, particularly in the current year, that we've been able to deliver actually more than the original 10-year plan figure, which was something that was discussed in October with councillors. So I think this is just part of our ability to start delivering this project, particularly like the Peninsula project that's now well underway, and obviously there's a pipeline of projects coming through. As part of the deliberations, we also talked about bringing in the PMO function to again help us in that delivery. So there.
Councillor Gary.
Mr. Logie, can you just clarify for me? I believe I understand this, but I just would like you to articulate it. With the Peninsula connection, we've heard mention that the debt is going up, but being brought forward, should I say, one of the reasons being to allow us to finish that project. And is it correct that through that project, each year that we delay, the subsidy goes down by 1%? Is that correct?
Yes, according to the group managed from Transport.
So that means that the NZTA subsidy would decrease the longer it takes, and the quicker we get it done, the more we get from NZTA. Thank you.
Councillor Benson-Pope. Oh, okay. Are there any further questions? Okay, so you're moving the resolutions as on
resolutions on page 25.
Okay, is there a seconder for that? Councillor Gary. Councillor Benson-Pope, you wish to speak to this? Right. Speakers. Councillor Van Divers.
I'll be brief since I've made these points before repeatedly. This annual plan is not sustainable. This annual plan is further fettered with the revelation that council companies not only are not going to be paying a dividend for yet another 3 years, zero dividend for the coming 3 years, but that they're going to actually take on $24 million worth of projected losses in the next 2 years. Where is that $24 million coming from? We need to look at group debt, because that's what we're liable for. It's the group that has the stadium debt spread across it, both in DCC and in DCHL. The DCHL projections from the latest SOI, the latest Statement of Intent, show that our debt, the budgeted debt that we're liable for, within 3 years, is going to be very close to $1 billion. The steepness of increase of this debt is unprecedented since at least 2003, when, quite frankly, debt was kind of negligible. We have a situation where we are wanting to sign off on a plan that is predicated on forward-loading unprecedented amounts of debt, $100 million a year for every one of the next 3 years, on the future council and the future ratepayers of the city. The debt level that we're talking about, the debt level that is being budgeted and that we are accountable for, amounts to more than $17,000 of debt for every ratepaying unit in Dunedin. I don't believe that we can do this with a hand on the heart and be sincere that this is the best that we can do. I think that the deferred maintenance, which has been a major problem not just in Aurora, but also in city properties and especially in stormwater renewals in our three waters, all of those things we have let slide for many years, and we are now loading on to the next 3 years and ticking off a 5% increase in the meantime to cover it all up. What have we actually got? What are we going to get for this immense amount of debt? We're going to get possibly a new cycleway up George Street. We're going to do some more work at extraordinary expense on the cycleway around the Peninsula. And if we look at the cycleways that we've already had for several years, the ones I drive past on a daily basis, those cycleways are not just underused. Most of the time there's no one using them at all. Debt and cycleways are the legacy of this council. The $100 million worth of new debt budgeted for every one of the next 3 years is a legacy of deferred maintenance of this council not controlling its council-controlled organisations and of not controlling its own maintenance issues. Nothing in this plan is going to do anything other than kick the can further down the road and kick the debt even higher. I can't vote for it on that basis.
Councillor O'Malley.
Councillor Vandervis raises the point that rates did not increase much during the period prior to the early 2000s, which would imply that the city had the same attitude to maintenance of its own assets that Aurora had to the maintenance of its assets. In fact, was probably instructed by the council at that time to deal with its assets in that way. And when you have deferred assets, you have deferred problems which come back to you and they bite you in the form of having to now accelerate your programs. These extra debts that Councillor Vandervis talks about that we are taking on are moving forward programs around asset management. It's about providing this resilient city. We are about to vote on climate emergencies, and yet we would slow down the development and the maintenance of our own infrastructure. That seems inappropriate. It also seems inappropriate that you would vote against cycleways if we're going to vote for acknowledging a climate emergency coming into the future. The only thing I would say is that we always need to be careful that we do not accidentally just keep increasing the rates without consideration. We do need to keep inside the target that we have for the next 10 years, and we need to keep an eye on that and make sure we're doing it. In terms of long-term debt for long-term use, the redevelopment of George Street and Princess Street, if that goes into 30-year long-term debt, that's because those are the people who are going to reap the benefit of it. So therefore, it's appropriate when you do an amenity spend that has a 30-year payoff that debt actually gets moved out over the period of when the people are taking benefit. As far as I can see, the debt in this council is well structured. And do we want to go back to the period of the late 1990s when the city was actually in its death throes? We are in a state of where people want to come and live in this city. They love this city. People come here and they go, this is an amazing place. Well, you get what you pay for. Thank you.
Councillor Wiley.
Thank you, Your Worship. I will actually follow on in a similar vein to Councillor O'Malley. When we looked at the annual plan and we created a cap of 5%, it was frustrating that we got over 5.3%. But at the time when we debated the annual plan and at the committee meeting, at the council meeting, we actually went through and we said, what could we take out? What would make a difference? And there really wasn't anything. We could have easily added more to it, but to remove was not going to be a factor. When I look at the capital projects, we had 89 million on budget. We're up to 125 million. Why? Because there is a lot to do. And when I look at a 5.3% increase, yes, and I've taken flak from some of my friends around the city, they said, you had to keep it under 5%. I said, look how much more we're doing with that money. And I think that's the value that every resident's going to see, is there is going to be return for the spend across the city. No one is being left behind. And when we look at, and I thought they did it really well, on page 91 of our attachments, it shows where the money is going. And I thought that was really good, really clear. $37 out of $100, 37% is going to three waters. I've heard a lot of people come to this table, these meetings, and talked about increasing and improving the water infrastructure in our city. There's $37 out of 100 are going in for that. That's really important. $20 for reserves and recreational facilities, 20%. Libraries and museums, $16. Anybody who wants to question where the money is going, it's all right out there in black and white. So I think the council has done a good job on this one. Thank you.
Councillor Lord. Okay. Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Your Worship. It feels sometimes like some round our table want the shoe small on the outside and big on the inside. They want the infrastructure renewal, but they don't want to pay for it. Well, guess what? We have to pay for it. And we have deliberated, we have listened, we have considered, we have debated all of these matters really thoroughly. For somebody just coming along to the meeting today in the public gallery, they may have thought, listening to my colleague, Councillor Vandervis, that everything's doom and gloom and that we are being extremely irresponsible with our spending. So I want to reassure those people that we have considered, thought, listened and debated very thoroughly on this and have arrived at our annual plan decisions after considerable consideration. This is an investment in our city, it's an investment in our people. And I want to take one example, which won't be a surprise to any of you. And I want to correct my colleague that the Peninsula Connection is not a cycleway project. It is a safety improvement project. It has a cycleway aspect and a walkway aspect, and the cycleway was a bonus. And I'm very happy to see it there, but it is a safety improvement project for all who live, visit and work on the peninsula and for the wider city, and it's a great asset. And the community there has been incredibly patient around the completion of that project, which will be of huge benefit to the wider city. And so that money is an investment. It is not an overspend. And we have to spend it in order to get that subsidy from NZTA, and every year we delay, that subsidy goes down. That has been widely consulted on, And yes, we have taken into account sea level rise. I often have people ask me, how has that been factored in? Of course, that's been factored in as well. So I will be absolutely supporting this. We have debated it thoroughly today, previously, and today we have to vote on it. And I urge you all to do the same.
Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just don't want to go through the process that got us here. I want to agree with Councillor Van Visser's comments back in 2004 and 2009 and how difficult life would be around this table should we ever build a stadium. And he was correct. But what I really want to do is to congratulate the staff that despite that, despite everything that the councils before us, and I was part of it, did to get us a stadium, they have managed their accounts in such a way that the rates increases haven't been substantial. They've paid down a lot of the debt, and and it takes leadership to do that. And the people in this room that really deserve our attention today are those that have managed the finances, managed and led the council staff to a position where we're in today, that we're not only doing the renewals that were deferred so that we can do other things like stadiums, but actually getting onto that work in a time frame much quicker than we ever presumed in 2010 when we made some of those decisions. And I'd really like to give that credit to the staff who've managed that, because as much as we've made decisions around this table, it has been the operational side that's provided those benefits, and in a way that has given us so many more options. Later today we'll be making some decisions about the future and who should be paying for that and who should be caring about that, and I hope the same debates are used around the table then about facing the challenges of the future, as we've heard expressed around this table on this issue. Thank you.
Because Councillor Benson-Pope, your right of reply.
Just to make an observation around process, I think it's evident in the media, in the editorial columns, and to an extent in the presentations that have been made to us today, that the wider community still doesn't realise the extent of the statutory requirements for consultation that we face. And while I welcome and understand the reasons for people coming along with bright ideas and brilliant suggestions that need to be followed, and in many cases will be, the fact is that the issues that they focus on often have been debated not just for months but for years as part of statutory consultative processes, as part of the long-term plan and as part of the annual plan. And I think while this has been a very good, incrementally even better than before, the way the process has been managed by staff around information around this annual plan and the preceding long-term plan, I think we do need to do more work in the wider community to encourage people who have suggestions and things they want to bring to us to get involved in doing so while that process is running, rather than coming along at the end. I'm mindful of editorial comment, letters to the editor about George Street. Some of them good, some of them informed, some not, but all of them too late. And I think we need to make sure that the wider understanding of the processes that we are constrained by is encouraged in the wider community.
Okay, I'm going to put this, the adoption of the annual plan. All those in favour, please say aye.
Division, please.
A division. Okay.
Can we have A, B and C separately then, please? It's only B that I want to vote against.
Only B that
Sorry,
you wish.
it's B. I'm happy to vote for B. It's A and C that I want to vote against.
Okay, so you're asking me to have A and C separate from B?
Please, thank you.
That's fine. So the first division is A and C.
Councillor Benson-Pope. Councillor Elder. Councillor Gary.
Aye.
Councillor Hall. Councillor Hawkins. Councillor Lefiso. Councillor Lord. Councillor Newell. Councillor O'Malley. Councillor Steedman. Councillor Vandervis. Councillor Wiley. Councillor Wilson. Your Worship.
Yes.
Carried 13-1.
Right, and now B.
Councillor Benson Pope. Councillor Elder. Councillor Gary.
Aye.
Councillor Hall. Councillor Hawkins. Councillor Lefiso. Councillor Lord. Councillor Newell. Councillor O'Malley. Councillor Steadman. Councillor Vandervis.
Aye.
Councillor Wiley. Councillor Wilson. Your Worship.
Yes,
Carried unanimously.
thank you. I would point out that there wouldn't be a way of making minor editorial changes if we didn't adopt it. Just a little logical problem there. Right, item 13, setting of rates for the 2019-20 financial year. Can I invite Mr. Toombs and Ms. Allen? Right, do you wish to introduce this at all, or just go straight to questions? Sure. So, councillors, questions? If there are any? There are none by the look of it, so the recommendations are too long to have on my agenda paper, but would someone like to move the recommendations? Moved Councillor Newell, seconded Councillor Hall. Do you wish to speak to it, Councillor Newell? Any further speakers? If there are none, I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against?
No, recorded, please.
Thank you. All right, item... That was quick. Almost painless. Item 14, DCC submission on the review of New Zealand walking access. You might as well have stayed here, Ms. Graham. Do you wish to introduce this at all?
So, if I may, councillors, apologies from Rob and Claire, who are unable to be here today for family reasons. So I'm happy to answer as best I can in their absence.
Okay, questions, councillors? Councillor Wilson.
Thank you. The submission itself is fine, except for I think I sat in a meeting a couple of years ago with a surveying school about the more flexible walking access right. It was called by Professor George Benwell an easement, which would provide landowners more flexibility to provide access over their property that wasn't necessarily there all the time, and it could be done on an app and turned on and off, basically. And the one thing that comes out of this, if we're doing a review, is the opportunity of providing a more flexible framework to provide or grant access, and that isn't in there. And I'm just wondering why I didn't get the feeling, having read it through, that it seems to be the easements are all of the time or not, and I didn't really get the feeling that they'd provided for an alternative, more flexible easement system. And I'm just wondering whether we could add that in, or is that something that's been covered by the staff in the past?
There are a couple of themes in the proposal around barriers to landowners providing public access. We could mention the use of technology or a review of how easements work as part of that. That would be...
It would be great. It's not only a time thing, it's actually also the alignments, which can change with what you've got in paddocks and things like that. And I think the hard line of actually granting an easement, which is a legal right, as opposed to an appeasement, which has the idea of being able to move around the farming functions, would be a fantastic proposition.
Thinking where it would best fit, but it would be somewhere under theme 4, I think, but it's hard to wordsmith on the fly.
Yeah, no, well, I equally found it hard to work it out. Yeah.
Councillor Vandervis.
Does this submission address the issue of farm owners being liable for people harming themselves as a result of crossing their properties. Is it sufficient, for instance, for a farmer to simply put a do not enter sign on their farm gates, and if people then enter and fall down a broken bridge or something, as has happened in the past, that they can avoid liability that way?
I think the submission is attempting to address that in para 12, A, B and C.
Do you think it has been addressed, really, is the issue?
That
Is it safe for farmers to allow people onto their land, given some of the extraordinary court cases that we've had in the past?
All I can say is I think we've acknowledged that there's an issue and barriers with landowners providing public access, and we're responding to that theme. Whether it's adequate or not will depend, I guess, on what eventuates with any legislative change.
Thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
Sorry, the other issue, and I didn't quite understand it, I'm just looking for the section, it was about equality of access or something, and I felt that that was more a conflict situation between cycling and walking, and I may have misunderstood it, but the one area, and I was in Whangarei and went on the AH Reid walk, which is actually provided for people with mobility issues, and we don't have a lens that actually requires, say, 5 or 10% of our access or nature walks or whatever to be provide for people with prams or for mobility issues. And I thought it was an issue that could be added in there with more clarity. I wasn't 100% sure that it was covered off in the equality issues that were part of that submission. And I would very much like to see it added if it was possible.
So I thought that that was covered in theme 2, para 9. A and B, where it's looking at the standard that exists, and also around, which is focused, as I understand it, on providing access on that deals with age, gender, family situations, disability. So I thought that covered it, but if you've got wording that you think...
I may be slightly incorrect, and I'm not quite sure of the track standards. I'm sorry, I haven't had...
Like how schooled up I've become since...
I sat on a meeting all day yesterday on access tracks with Doc, and my understanding of some of those tracks are very much they're tramping tracks and possibly for mountain biking, but they're not. I may have the standard wrong, but I am very nervous when it comes to some of their standards as being acceptable for mobility scooters and prams. Yeah.
So the focus of the submission is to try and maintain, try and suggest and increase multi-use tracks wherever possible, noting that there are some tracks that will be better suited for cyclists, for example, and some that are better suited for pedestrian-only style uses.
Councillor Elder.
Just looking at theme 2 towards equal access, and I recognise that multi-access angle on it. It says here the DCC would like to see a stronger emphasis on increased inclusive mobility where possible. So does that fit that criteria around inclusive being disability and mobility challenged people?
That was the intention, but if councillors have words that they think would better enable that, I'm happy to take any feedback.
Thank you.
Further questions? Okay, if there are no further questions, would someone like to move the resolution? Move Councillor Elder, second Councillor Hall, and I take it that we are approving the DCC submission on the review of the Walking Access Act, taking into account the comments that have been just made and that Ms Graham has recorded, which will be amendments or additions. So, are there any speakers? Do you wish to speak to this, Councillor Elder?
I think that walking access forum is a really important one, and an important one to submit to. I think there's an understanding that being in nature and walking or biking or or being pushed in a wheelchair for that matter, in nature is very, very good for our health and well-being. So to actually to submit to this is also about recognising the growing need for other users to be able to use our track systems, and that means also around cycling and those interests as well. So, and the emphasis on having diverse tracks and also multi-use tracks. And I believe that Dunedin actually has an amazing asset that during the tracks audit and in the next couple of years we can really maximise the opportunity for our whole community to be involved and out in nature. So I endorse and support this move.
Thank you. Further speakers? There are none. I'm going to put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Item 15, submission to Kāinga Ora, Homes and Communities Bill. Can I invite Ms Oianu, Mr Christie and Ms Gunn? Welcome. Any of you wish to?
Just might make one.
Oh.
Doesn't look on. Yeah, okay. Yeah, just wanted to note that to make sure that it was clear that the bill has been split in half. So this submission is on the establishment of Kāinga Ora, formerly the Urban Development Authority, and that the next part of the work will be about the bill to set out its powers. So this is not about the powers of that body.
Thank you. Right, I'll open up to questions. Questions, councillors, if there are any. Councillor O'Malley.
Thank you, Your Worship. It's just a question about point number 10 in the letter that says that much of South Dunedin's housing is old and poor quality. Well, I hear that fairly often. Can you tell me how much of it is old and of poor quality? Like, do we have a percentage?
I don't have that data to hand, but we can find out what we do have and get it to you.
Yeah, it'd be quite good if you can get it at relative to other suburbs. Thank you.
Any further questions? If there are none, would someone like to move the resolution? Councillor Hawkins, seconded Councillor Wilson. Councillor Hawkins, do you wish to speak to it? Any other speakers? There are none. I'll put all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Item 16, proposed parking changes. Can I invite Mr Drew and Mr Saunders to join us? Well, you're already here, but join us up here. To introduce it? Or
No, happy to.
Questions? Questions, councillors? Right. Councillor Vandervis.
Why are we going ahead with a parking change that denies so many commuter parks in the face of so many submissions opposing?
So the significant number of submissions received for this one related to the tertiary precinct when they were sorted through by staff. There were submissions relating to the warehouse precinct, and there was the only speaker at the hearing was also speaking to the warehouse precinct proposal. But the reason for the deferral of the tertiary precinct was down to the number of submissions we received on that topic and the feeling from staff that was better taken care of as part of the wider tertiary precinct review.
Councillor O'Malley.
So I just want to clarify then. So we are voting on a proposal where the tertiary precinct parking has been put to the side for further consultation. And is it also the case that on some of the parts of Bond Street, the difference between what has been put in front of us now and what was originally proposed for public consultation did in fact listen to feedback on uncontrolled parking, and in fact that area has been also postponed till we get more data so we understand what we're looking at?
That's correct. So there was a specific, there was a change to the proposals based specifically on feedback for those Bond Street all-day parks, which is reflected in the report, and that'll be considered further when those further upgrade works are done down in that area of the city.
So in quick summary, we pretty much did respond to the submissions and modified either the actions going forward or the actual designs of what we're going forward in this final consultation piece. Thank you.
Any further questions? If there are none, Councillor Wiley, you've indicated you're prepared to move. Is there a seconder? Councillor O'Malley. Do you wish to speak to it, Councillor Wiley?
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you to my fellow panel members, Councillor Benson-Pope and Councillor O'Malley. First off, I can tell you I was very relieved to see us not have to consider the tertiary precinct parking, and that has been postponed. But when we look at what we did consult on, which is in and around the warehouse district, probably the key thing that was really of note was, one, the work that staff did was actually very good in that way, in the sense they consulted. The only comment that I would make is, when we look at consultation, sometimes it is mail drop, sometimes it is basically just even delivering it to the residents that are there. I think there's a combination where we did hear that the rate, people paying the rates are not getting the information versus the tenants that are receiving the information, and there's a disconnect between the two parties. They're not passing it on. So I think it's really important as we go through with a lot of these, and especially when we hit the tertiary precinct, that we are not only just dropping flyers in the mailbox. And as I talked to one student yesterday, they opened the mailbox on Sunday for the first time in 3 months. So they, to turn around and actually also deliver it manually or by post to the ratepayers. Probably the key thing that for anybody wanting to read this report is that no parks were lost as per our papers on page 76 and 77. It clearly articulates how the parks were moved around in some cases, and also an increase in motorbike parking as was requested. So the minor changes are mostly to assist in improving the safety of the area, and many were a request of nearby. The minor changes also in the paper are mostly to assist improving safety of the areas that were listed, and were at the request of nearby residents and property owners. So all in all, I think when we look at the Bond Street area and the warehouse district, it's great to see staff taking the initiative and putting sensors down to see if they can capture more information, and also the fact that we aren't doing any work on the east side of Bond Street to remain unchanged until after infrastructure work has been completed. So thank you.
Further speakers? There are none. In that case, I'm going to put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? It's carried. Right, on to item 17, declaring climate emergency. Given that this was largely a result of community request, Councillor Hawkins, you happy to...
Just when you read.
Sorry?
Go on, I'm just putting myself on the speaking order.
Right, okay. Well, given that this was very largely a result of requests from the community, some of which continue today, there's no... There is a report on this, but it's not for... necessarily for staff to be answering questions on it. All the questions have been answered in the report, anything that staff think about it. So I will invite, I'm more than happy for anyone to ask questions of clarification. Councillor Wilson, and then, is that what you wish to do? Or
I'll do a question after you.
I'm just indicating a willingness to move a resolution.
Yeah, I thought that might be the case. But did you have a question of clarification, Councillor Wilson?
Yes, I just, in light of a number of comments that we're not doing enough or we're not doing anything, I'm just wondering if the CEO could be asked to just explain some of the things that we are doing, or what difference this might make if we did do this.
Look, it would probably be wise for us to bring a report to council outlining everything we're doing in this sphere. We have got a fairly extensive work program, both in the mitigation and particularly, of course, in the adaptation area. We've got quite a lot of the reason for our increasing debt is both about dramatic escalation in our renewals, but also particularly in about new work to fit us for climate change, for sea level rise. As you're aware, there's quite a lot of money going into South Dunedin. Both the harbour front work and the hospital are, despite what the speaker suggested that they'll be able to be flooded, they are both being built for IPCC, the 100-year flood projections. So there's work going on like that. There is a lot of deferred renewals going on and being made up for in the council, and a lot of that is being made. We're making those good for the new standards. So expecting sea level rise, expecting increases in groundwater. The around the harbour edge actually enables us to lift the height of that road, for example. So there is a lot of money being spent on that, as well as this. I was just talking with General Manager of Services about our own corporate sustainability initiatives, which we're pulling together into a single document so that we can show you what it is we're corporately doing just as an organisation within the city. So things like looking at at travel management for staff, for example, stuff we've done around our own lighting and changing the LED lights to LED lights for power saving. And so I think rather than just kind of me thinking off the top of my head about what some of those might be, I can tell you there's a lot going on, and it might be useful that we pull together a bit of an overview of what some of those key projects are. As you're aware, through Maria Inoanu's team doing carbon measurements, so getting baseline measurements and then being able to actually track the difference that we're making, that's also been a pretty critical part of us signing up to the objectives as a city of becoming a lot more carbon neutral and making a contribution that we should as a citizens and as a city.
Right, any further questions? Councillor O'Malley.
Just clarifying by the paper, are we actually going to, I see there's Councillor Hawkins is proposing another motion, so we'll go with that one, but I mean the one that, are we going for point 7 in the report as the declaration, or are we just considering whether we're going to do a declaration?
Well, that depends really on Councillor Hawkins' motion.
Well, because in point 7 is a fast action of 10 years or less to reach negative emissions.
Yeah. No, it's a reasonable distinction, but if Councillor...
After something that's an immediate papers.
So the short answer, I think, would be fair to say, Councillor O'Malley, that...
On with this one.
Well, it won't be just deciding to declare, it'll be a little more detailed than that. Yeah. So that's up there. I'd like to clear up any questions of process or clarification or anything before we move to discussing the actual resolution. Councillor Wiley, sorry, you did have your hand up.
Yeah, I've got a question for the Chief, for the CEO. Do we have any other emergencies in town?
From time to time.
Do we have
the last few have largely been around climate. So flooding, for example, seems to be the regular. That's the most common one that we're faced with, fire, but flooding in particular.
Okay, so flooding in 215, we declared an emergency?
Yep, and 216 and 217.
Actually, we didn't. That's the point, yep. I think.
Okay. Is there anything else on our books that would look like we would have to declare an emergency going forward? I didn't see anything in the annual plan, and I didn't see anything in the long-term plan, so I've seen this one.
This is a political decision, so whether it's up to you to decide whether on any risk matrix you've got likelihood and you've got impact. You will make your own determination of the likelihood of sea level rise, climate change, of the current rate of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the impact that it's going to have on climate. You've seen what IPCC have said, you've seen what the vast bulk of climate scientists have said. there are some people who disagree with that, and I see all of the emails that go around you. So you'll make your own determination about where you sit on that spectrum around likelihood. There is no doubt that if it comes to pass, the consequences potentially catastrophic if you're at the worst end of that spectrum. And on most risk matrices, even a low likelihood but a very catastrophic consequence would put you into the category of needing to do something about it. Those risk matrices don't tell you whether to declare an emergency. It's a political response, if you like.
So for some of our residents, would you consider that there's potentially a housing emergency in our city?
I think you're as well placed to consider that as I am.
Thank you.
I would say, Councillor Wiley, that emergencies are almost by definition, not susceptible to prediction. They happen, but you don't. If you knew they were going to happen, there probably wouldn't be an emergency. Any further questions of clarification before we go on to the substantive motion? Oh, Councillor Elder.
Just on that point, so someone said climate change is like a slow-moving earthquake in a sense, and I suppose could one call that a potential emergency?
Well, look, I think that goes to the heart of the question that we're going to be considering and whether to declare one, and I think that's a question for each of us to answer as we vote. Right, Councillor Hawkins, you've moved, or you're moving, so is there a seconder? Councillor Laufiso? All right, Councillor Hawkins, can I invite you to speak to your motion?
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. And I want to start by picking up on Councillor Wilson's question really around what is it that we have done or are doing, and some of these things are at varying stages through policy and advocacy and action, and they traverse not just the actions of this council, but those that have gone before it. Council divested itself from fossil fuels. This council took a stand against deep-sea oil and gas extraction. We joined the Global Compact of Mayors and set a target of becoming a zero-carbon city by 2050. We've invested in safer cycling and walking. We're making progress towards better public transport, supporting neighbourhood-scale resilience, increased stormwater capacity to deal with extreme weather events caused by an increasingly unstable climate, and most recently, $1 million in the budget over the next 2 years to accelerate our climate change work, just for starters. The presenters that have come to speak to us at Public Forum and the thousands of students that have been marching in the streets aren't telling us that we haven't been doing anything, because quite clearly we have been. All they're telling us is that we're not doing enough. It's not enough, and it's not like we weren't warned. Even in the short time that I've been involved in this council, we've had presentations over the years, thorough and exhaustive and considered presentations from groups like Transition Valley, groups like Sustainable Dunedin City, countless individuals who came and told us about the nature of the problem and the urgency of the problem and the kinds of things that local government could do to address it. And those haven't been particularly effective at catalysing urgent action at local government. So this conversation around the language of emergency, and I understand that there are academic arguments on both sides of that around whether it's too alarmist or whatever, the rational, persuasive, thorough, considered academic arguments that have been presented to us haven't been that effective, and meanwhile the clock is ticking, because over the next decade we need to do everything within our power to clean up the mess that we've put ourselves in and avoid ending up in an even bigger one, should we choose to do nothing. This needs to be at the front and centre of all of our decision making, which is a point that was made loud and clear during the public forum, and it's accurate. That will mean that we will have to have some very difficult conversations, and not just ones around car parking and transport and town planning, and not just around how we support the residents in our low-lying communities in the longer term, but also conversations around how sustainable long-haul visitor economy is as being a driver, no pun intended, of our local economy. Those sorts of questions. I'm not an environmentalist by any normal definition of the word. I grew up in the trade union movement and come from a social justice background. So this is not my field of academic expertise, but I'm happy to defer to those people for whom it is. but I came to the realisation a few years ago that this is a social justice issue, actually. Climate change is a question of fairness because locally, nationally and globally, the people who have contributed the least to the problem are the ones who have to deal with the problem and are least equipped to be able to deal with it. A lot's been made of our Prime Minister's comments around this being, climate change being the nuclear-free moment of her generation, and that's been widely interpreted as saying that this is the defining issue of our time. And it's worth noting that during the nuclear-free movement, a number of towns and cities joined that movement by declaring themselves, rather symbolically, as nuclear-free towns and cities. And perversely, this movement also puts us at odds with the United States administration. But the nuclear-free movement largely didn't require us to do much and change much about how we acted and how we behaved. The climate emergency requires us to change almost everything about what we are doing and how we behave. Is it symbolic? Well, it could be. It could be a hollow symbolism. What it needs to be is a catalyst for more urgent action. And that's the challenge to this council, to future councils, to us, to this city, to everyone, really. I've taken the liberty of amending what was proposed and setting effectively bringing forward our existing target as a city of being net zero carbon by 2050, because that's, and that was a decision that was made by either this council or the previous council based on the best advice that we had at the time, and obviously science evolves and that is less likely to prove adequate if we're to meet the 1.5 degree limits, the targets that we've set through the Paris Agreement. But even if it was the ultimate target still 2050, I don't think that's adequate for two reasons. One, because the science around this is constantly evolving, and if it does come forward and our planning is based around a 2050 timeframe, we run the risk of doing far too little too late. But also, if your target is the very last minute, which 2050 would be, you risk overshooting that, and the consequences of overshooting that if your target is the very last minute are quite dire. So I'd just like to thank all of the people who have come, not just to speak to us at this meeting, but in previous committee rounds, and expressing their concern and their desire for a greater urgency locally to do our bit to address this problem. They are, a lot of them have been young people, not exclusively, and I think the tenor with which the concern is held among younger people in our community is something that we need to dwell on as we consider this, because a business as usual approach is not just inadequate, it's effectively intergenerational theft, and I don't think we have any moral standing to drift onwards and leave them to clean up the mess of our own inertia. So I welcome support for this, but more importantly, the action that will follow from this in terms of giving effect to it through a climate emergency plan. Thank you.
Councillor Hawkins has quite rightly said that what is proposed is that we change almost everything about how we behave. And the reason for changing almost everything about how we behave is based on scientifically modelled projections of the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. Whether it's possible for us to change almost everything about how we behave is a fair question. Whether the scientifically modelled projections with the complexity of weather feedback loops are something strong enough evidence-wise to act on and to call an emergency is also a fair question. Whether anything we can do as a council will actually make any difference is another fair question. In terms of actually reducing CO2, if in fact it turns out that CO2 is the major problem. It might be methane, it might be goodness knows water vapour, whatever. But if CO2 is the major problem that needs to be addressed, and that we accept our leading academic, Professor Jim Flynn from Otago University, if we accept his proposal for what we do about it, his proposal is that we need to cool the atmosphere and sequester CO2 into the oceans by having our navies sending fleets of ships out into the sea with big pumps on them, putting plumes of seawater 25 metres into the air, sucking the heat and the CO2 out of the atmosphere. In his considered opinion, being one of our most esteemed academics, noted for his Flynn effect on intelligence, this is what he proposes as something that we as a society could do. I don't believe that we as a city council can do anything practical in that line. I very much doubt that we as a country could do anything practical in that line. And even if we did, I don't believe that it would have anything like the desired effect, given the amount of diesel it takes to run our ship fleet and to run pumps. So we've got a situation where we've had a lot of people today say that we need immediate and strong action. Now we need action, substantial changes, solutions. We've had some suggestions about some things that we might do. Very few of these solutions are something that we can either afford or something that I believe will make any difference anyway. We have been told that it's an emergency because South Dunedin is going to drown. The hospital is going to be flooded. We can't build our waterfront. This all assumes that there is going to be massive melting of on-land ice, which is not the Arctic, that's the Antarctic, and that this is going to happen inside 1,000 years. If you look at the amount of energy required to melt ice, and if you look at the amount of time that's required to melt ice, it's simply not possible for these extreme 2-metre rises in sea level to happen in anything like hundreds of years. The definition of an emergency is something which the Mayor referred to just recently when he said that it's something that you haven't been prepared for and that happens rather suddenly. It's not physically possible for sea level rise to happen suddenly. This can't happen. If we were absolutely sure of the scientifically modelled projections of the IPCC, then we could reasonably say, and I think most people sincerely do, say that, look, we have to do something now because CO2 is obviously going to become a serious sea level rise issue. But then the thing that they want us to do is basically paperwork and bureaucracy, none of which is going to make any difference to CO2 levels. The hope that the emissions trading scheme would make a difference to CO2 levels has been absolutely damned, because when you look at CO2 levels, they have continued to rise absolutely and inexorably despite the emissions trading scheme. Multi-billion-dollar international effort that did absolutely nothing. We can declare an emergency today. We can spend a whole lot of ratepayers' money producing all kinds of reports, and I have no doubt that we will. And none of it will have any influence at all on CO2 levels, if in fact they are the issue that is claimed. What I believe we have is not a climate emergency, we have a debt emergency. We have $1 billion worth of budgeted debt staring us in the face in the next 3 years. And the next 3 years is my idea of an emergency.
Point of order. That's not relevant to the conversation under discussion.
Well, probably be better. I'm not going to uphold the point of order. It's a reasonable comment to make, but I would suggest that since you've run out of time, you'd be better to stick to what's really pertinent.
Thank you. If I can just wrap up then. The real emergency that we have, if we are going to face a significant sea level rise, is one of investment in our drainage infrastructure. We have underinvested in drainage infrastructure grossly since the 2015 flood. Drainage renewals, stormwater renewals have been well under what was projected back then and continue to be well under despite a bring forward this year, which I'm glad of, but we need to spend a whole lot more money doing that. The $1 million that we've recently decided to spend on investigating climate responses should instead have been spent on new pumps and bigger pipes for South Dunedin. That is, I believe, an appropriate response for this council to use ratepayers' money to deal with climate issues. We need bigger pumps, we need bigger pipes, we need to spend more money on drainage. Thank you.
Thank you. Further speakers? Councillor O'Malley.
I'll definitely be voting for these, and I'm just going to give my points, really. I can remember where I was during the Springbok Tour in 1981. I can remember where I was during the nuclear free movement. In fact, I was one of those people who believed in these incremental declarations finally get the central government to do its thing. So my bedroom was a nuclear free zone before the city was. Then the city became a nuclear free zone, and then towns did, and then all up and down the country they joined, and when they joined, the central government realised it could no longer ignore it, and then New Zealand became a nuclear free zone. And then it had another impact. Governments got frightened that we had become a nuclear free zone, and that's the approach the Americans had to us once we did it. We reached out across the world from our very small spots by joining together and then effectively getting the nation to respond, and then the nation's response became an international response. This is exactly the same action we're doing here today. We aren't expecting to change large industrial nations of the Northern Hemisphere's actions by the Dunedin City Council doing a resolution today, but when all the councils in the country come together to do this, our government will have no option but to do it. And in much the same way that the opposition parties will say, well, I'm not coming, I will reverse it when I get back in the government, and finding that that reversal stops them getting back in the government, ends up getting adopted across the aisle. So that's the real reason you might want to start doing this. Why is this an emergency? You know, as a person who's been in the scientific community, I can tell you that when you go to get published, you have to be very conservative in your statements in order to get past the editors and your peer review. So when climatologists started talking about where they think things are going in the future, it was always the lower end of the predictions that were basically getting past the peer reviewers, because people were like, let's not be too hasty here. So if anything, all of this comment of where we're going has always been muted. And now we're getting to the point now where everybody has been looking at what could the future look like, and they're seeing the activities looking like we're going into something which is incredibly dangerous, and that is we look like we're going into something which can be called a forward feedback loop. If we warm up the top ends of Russia, where there's a lot of buried methane in permafrost, and that gets into the atmosphere, that itself will continue to accelerate warming. If the rock underneath the ice in Antarctica gets exposed, then the ability of Antarctica to absorb sunrise and get the energy you need to melt all that ice will happen, and that will accelerate. And if Greenland melts, we're going to see 5 metres of sea level rise. Now, none of these things will happen in their entirety, but when you add them up, we are looking at metres and metres of sea level rise. And yes, it isn't happening tomorrow, and it will happen over centuries, but it will happen. And if we don't do our bit now, it may go into a point that it cannot be stopped, and we'll just keep going forward. Not to act now, I've heard the word tsunami mentioned already today. Not to act now is a bit like people going down to the seashore when a tsunami rolls in to pick the fish that just suddenly became available. And then they're standing there, they get washed away by it. If we don't act now, this tsunami, and it's a geological tsunami, it will take a few hundred years to play itself completely out. It will roll over us. The declaration has not only effects on central government, but then it makes us affect our own planning and actions. And I welcome the setting the target of net zero carbon to 2030. That's a very ambitious target, by the way. But if we do adopt it, then we're going to have to follow in with actions. We're going to have to say that if we're going things like looking at our waste futures programs now, we're going to have to put the carbon impact in there. We have to put in the influence of public transport and active transport in reducing the activities of using single-use vehicles. Cities have to get moving down that path. I do want to draw out that we often keep saying South Dunedin when it comes to sea level rise, but I was surfing the internet while other people were talking today, but it wasn't for any other reason to find out the height of Dunedin Airport above sea level, 1.2 metres. A lot of people forget that the Taieri Plains is just as endangered from sea level rise as South Dunedin is, as is Waitati, as is Waikoiti, Harrington Point, Aramoana. We've got vast sections of the city that will be horribly affected by 1 or 2 metres of sea level rise. And the driving factor behind that is carbon dioxide and methane. And the real driver is deep carbon being drawn to the top. That's got a multi-million year cycle. Okay, it doesn't go back into the ground tomorrow. And the reason that some of it hasn't gone so high is because it's gone into the ocean in the form of carbonic acid. And now we've got an acidified ocean. And now we've got reefs dying all over the place. Those support spawning fish, which support the fish that we eat. A lot of societies collapse dramatically because they don't take into account the environment in which they are living. And by the time it is so obvious that they have failed, they have gone past the point of no return. And it's too late at that point. All the great societies that we talk about, and almost all the great continents, have gone through a boom and then an absolute collapse. But this is the first time in the history of humanity where we've managed to put the whole society all around the earth. And when we collapse this time, there's no valley to go to over the mountains. It's us. We're all going down together on this one. So there is an emergency. And there is no time to wait any longer. And I think that we've got to show, not just by declaring this emergency, which I think is good, but I actually have heard the other words. It has to be followed by actions and plans immediately afterwards. So I would hope that in the long-term plan coming up, we start enacting these propositions and put them into our budgets in terms of things that we're going to do that are going to be responsive to this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, and congratulations to the previous speaker on his impassioned speech. There is a valley over the mountains, and it will also be affected by climate change. And as a farmer, we have had many years of a very similar thing happening to us. People have talked about tsunamis. I compare this much more to a drought. A drought comes very, very slowly. You don't know if it's really, really happening. You're hoping it doesn't happen, and yet the ones that act and prepare for it earliest are the ones that come through it. And you never know how hard it's going to be, but you have to plan for it right at the start. And all the advice of and it's always based on predictions, and varying predictions of forecasters, and they're never absolutely right, and some places will get rain before others and whatever. And some places will be much better on a drought than others. This declaring a climate emergency will come with costs, but it will also come with opportunities. Some areas will be better off if we plan for them. Some areas will need significant change. I would rather die trying than not try at all. And the thought of 2030, and if we fail, but we've got time to act more. I totally agree. By acting, hoping to 2050 and not getting there, not having done enough, and failing then is far too late. This is really, really hard stuff. It's not just about sea level rise, it's about substantial flooding. In many ways, I'm glad that we haven't changed our, renewed all of our stormwater pipes now, because I don't think that 10 years ago we actually would have made them big enough. I think we're in a lot better space now to say, actually, we need to be making them much bigger. We need to be making sure that they're not discharging onto other people's properties, and to build the network that we have much more clarity now than we did 10 years ago how the world is changing. It is changing. It doesn't matter who's made it happen. It doesn't matter that we are only one small part of it, but if we don't do our part, we can't expect other people to do what is going to be required to be much more significant change. And I'm very, very happy as a farmer to support this. I'm just going to close with one thing though, and I'm really sad with some of the messaging that's come over about it's them and us. And there was a comment today about dairy farmers, yet many of us drink lattes and flat whites. I think we need to be seen to be doing this together, not blaming people, not trying to be one better than the lowest industry. We're going to do this because we are going to be able to afford some of this stuff because we've got farmers. And that's really hard stuff. Everyone is going to have to transition. And I just hope that we're not putting the blame game. We actually have to show the leadership game, and that's about being the change that we want to happen.
Thank you, Your Worship. I want to tell you a story. The subject of climate change first arose in our household when the daughter of the household was completing a primary school project. And she was about the age of the children that came here today to speak to us. She was well supported by her father, who was well versed in early writings about the issue of climate change, and less so by me, who was somewhat sceptical at the time. That young primary school child is now a well-educated, well-travelled young adult who has turned her concern into activism around climate change. And while she has been on that journey, her mother has been on her own journey. So I have come from a place where I had a total lack of awareness about climate change to this day. And along the way, I have noted the community's views on this have changed. I was in Te Papa on last Wednesday, and they have a new exhibition there that is a cave-like enclosure, and you enter it, and there are birds all around, and you press the button, and you don't know till you've pressed the button which of those birds, unless you look at the title and recognise the bird, whether or not they are still in existence or extinct. And it really struck me how many of those beautiful birds were extinct, and there was no bird song when you pressed the button at that point. The ones that are still here had the beautiful bird song. It was another reminder about the possible impact of climate change. Along that journey, I have marched with my daughter. One of the most emotional moments in my relationship with my daughter was to march with her on the 15th of March in the last part of that protest. And wasn't that a day? And wasn't that extraordinary, those young people turning out? I have talked with people in my community who are very aware around the protection of wildlife and the possible impact of climate change on them, and around the events, the weather events that we are increasingly experiencing and the impact on us as a community. And I've noticed a shift. I've noticed a shift in the community I live in from people expecting other people to address it and actually taking some responsibility. And I've noticed a shift in the community I live in around people thinking about what they can personally do and the expression of wanting leadership in this area. I have never pretended to have all the answers, but what I do know is that we have a problem, a huge problem of global proportions backed by solid scientific research. I'm not going to traverse that science because my colleagues have done that really well, and I note Councillor Hawkins traversed that particularly well. And my colleague to my right, who is a scientist. And it is going to take considerable change in the way we live our lives and action to mitigate and adapt to the situation, and we haven't much time. It's urgent, and our young people in particular are demanding that decision makers like us and across the world take notice and act now. And I noticed in the public gallery today the thing that has struck me, and I was particularly touched to see the children come, and weren't they articulate, incredibly articulate. Through all ages, through all walks of life, are people here today engaging with us, and I thank them for that. And I was struck last time we met that as we were discussing these matters, we could hear the chants of the protesters, including my daughter, out in the building behind us. From our vote at the start of this term of council, when we voted against further oil and gas exploration as a council, to more recently, when just a week or so ago, we voted to establish and commence the delivery of a detailed work program for climate mitigation and adaptation at a cost of $525,000 in the next financial year and $572,000 in the following financial year, with progress reported back to council. That's getting into the action behind the words. So I will be exercising my vote to give voice to this imperative and do what I can, as I urge all of my colleagues around this table to exercise their votes in their decision-making capacity on this matter. I don't have all the answers, none of us do, but I do know that these critical decisions affect the future generations. I applaud the young people in this city and all of those who've made their voices heard and made us take notice. I believe that when I'm making these decisions and deciding how I'm going to vote, I keep in focus, as I said, when the very first vote of this triennium around the oil exploration, I thought about my daughter, and I urge you to think about your children and grandchildren. I want to be able to look her in the eye. She was in the public gallery earlier today, and I want to be able to look her in the eye tonight and know that the decision and the vote that I have made is the right one. And I would urge all of you to think about your children and grandchildren and the children of this city when you cast your vote now.
Councillor Newell.
Thank you, Worship. To be honest with you, I was a bit down on this initially, thinking it was going to be nothing more than a self-congratulatory hand shandy. However, we as a council in the main are behind you, and your message is our message. We've heard you loud and clear. Our community forum have asked us to act and act fast at a rate of about 5 to 1 of any other topic we've had since I've been in council, even car parking. All levels of government must act and act faster. We've heard from the aged and we've heard from the youth. I fear it's us in the middle who've been last to learn. The fact that we have to explain to anyone around this table, or indeed anyone in the Western world, that the rate of sea level rise is exponential, the reckonings of these people must no longer be entered into. We simply don't have time. There is none so blind as those that will not see. Except to say, 97% of climate scientists agree in human-induced climate change. If 97% of surgeons suggested that you have an operation to remove a tumour to save your life, would you submit, or would you argue your reckonings? We are that tumour, and short of removing it from the planet, we must adapt. The tipping point is close, and once we hit that, the Earth will continue to heat up with no respite. This is known as the forward feedback loop. As to pet projects, yes, I have mine, and it is certainly waste. We have an amazing opportunity with the closure of the Green Island landfill and our moving to a new venue to make this not only a grave for our, well, preferably not a grave for our inaction, but a sorting and refining place for our unused resources. On a larger point, we can have as many bus rides and keep cups as we want. Without central government leadership around the ETS, water tax, and product stewardship, I fear we're lost. Whilst we have a central government that supports the growth of animal agriculture and offshore drilling, no one wants to address the bovine in the room. Two of the world's leading ecologists and environmentalists, David Attenborough and Jane Goodall, and many other client scientists have suggested the easiest and quickest way we can do anything for our environment is eat less meat and dairy. So to extrapolate that out, we as a country need to produce less animal agriculture en masse and diversify. Animal agriculture is one of the leading causes of deforestation and a leading cause of greenhouse gases and a major polluter of our water supplies. Not to mention 30% of the the world's grain production is fed to stock. This Act today must be followed up with pressure on central government. Without any further action, like revision of dates and targets, this would be nothing more than a well-intended branding exercise and nothing else. We need to be on the right side of history.
Thank you, Worship. Yeah, look, I'm not going to support this. There's two reasons. The second part is we've had no report that gives us cost of what the implication for this council would be to bring those carbon net zero by 2030 forward, so I can't vote for that on that thing. But the other part about being a climate emergency, and I wasn't necessarily going to question the CEO like Councillor Wiley was earlier, but I think about an emergency and I think, what is an emergency? It's something like, I just happened to see something the other day and it just said, if you've got if this is an emergency, ring 111. And I just thought to myself, that's what I would do in an emergency. Well, depending what the emergency was, of course, but I feel about an emergency as something that it's use of words that's very emotive and it's words that will alarm people and maybe unnecessarily. I believe in this council, if we're going to have sea level rise based on what we see, and I see that steady 1.7 mils a year has been happening for the last, as we understand and we're led to believe, the last 1,000 years, I don't see any great increase. Now, before Jim, Councillor O'Malley, calls out like he did last time, go to Kiribati, Councillor Lord. The actually amazing thing is that you can go to Kiribati, it's still there. And in 2008...
One point of order. I didn't call out in the middle of the councillor's speech. It was in my speech after he sat down that I made that point.
Good point. Anyway...
Well, you've acknowledged that, that's fine.
In 2008, when we were told that it would be gone by 2013, by Al Gore and lots of other islands, and they're still there. And I just feel that as a council, who our main role is to spend and replace infrastructure, we can still do that. And we've got 100 years or more. You've just said, Councillor O'Malley, that it could be 1,000 years before some of these things come to pass. Our infrastructure is going to be replaced 10 times in that period. And I think just prudent planning by the right people in our departments, by the right engineers to engineer solutions. We don't need to alarm people. We just need to spend and do that as part of our business as usual. So I won't be supporting this.
Councillor Steadman.
Thank you, Worship. I'm caught because I actually I want to see all this happen. But I'm caught with the word emergency. Most of you know where I come from, my background, and saving people's lives, shotguns pointed at me, and that sort of thing. That's an emergency. I do not want to put the fear of God into the people that I'm representing. I've had phone calls at home that I've not had before over this particular subject because of that word emergency. That is my concern. It's putting the fear of God into everybody. And yes, people should be fearful of climate change and what it is doing to our planet. There is no doubt about that in my mind. But it's just some of our people just do not understand what we're possibly trying to get that message across. And I just don't want to see them being fearful. The amount of calls I got when the Mayor mentions at times about retreat in the South Dunedin area, the people do not understand what that means. They think it's putting up the white flag and we're moving out straight away. Where am I going to live? I don't have a place to go and live because I'm now all of a sudden being told I'm leaving my house because we're being told we're retreating. That's what I'm saying. It's just, we make a bold statement like that, emergency, it puts the fear of God into people and they think the absolute worst, that their life is going to be over because we actually are representing all demographics in our society, not just one that actually does understand what we're trying to talk about, but it's the other people that do not understand. So I'm very supportive of B down, maybe if the wording could change, but it's not going to. You know, instead of having that word emergency in there, that's the only reason why. So thank you.
The speakers. Councillor Wiley.
Thank you, Your Worship. I will not be supporting this either. And one of the key reasons was because exactly what I asked the CEO. Is this an emergency? For some it is. But really in the context, is it an emergency? What is an emergency? The dictionary definition is a serious, unexpected and often dangerous situation requiring immediate action. Some of you in this room, actually quite a few, I can hear them behind me, some in the gallery, believe it's immediate action. Great, that's fine. Yes, the climate is changing. I'm fully ready to acknowledge that. Not a problem. I have supported many of the various climate change related papers that have come across the council table. I supported the council joining the United Nations and their 17 chapters recently. I supported the annual plan funding of $525,000 for 1920 and $572,000 for 2021 of the Climate Resilience Work Programme. When we look at all this, we currently have a sensible approach that we've engaged with. Now, all of a sudden, we've had a small number of groups come to us, and they want us to change the playing field. So are we going to do this every time a handful of groups come to us? I thought we had an annual plan. I thought we had a long-term plan. We had processes, we were going down a pathway. Oh, actually, we'll change that now. We'll just flip over and do this. So I hope the councillors that support this climate emergency will actually make an instant change to their lifestyles. That is, you now leave your cars at home and take the bus. You invest in solar. And I'd hate to see you in the supermarket buying those bananas from Central America. I hope you're not wearing clothes made in China or any other countries that are huge emitters. Oh yeah, let's not forget about the mining and minerals that are required for your cell phones, laptops and televisions. They've got quite a footprint. I take it with the dramatic rise in electric cars that you'll support wind turbines on the hills around our city, or another couple of hydro dams up in central Otago. For my family and I, we're already making changes in the way we live and what we do. We do it at home. And talking with our friends, they're also doing the same. Yes, households around Dunedin are already making the changes they feel that are important to them. Yes, I believe that council could do more, especially around the city economy and reducing what ends up in the landfill. Now, I take it that I would say that many of you have already invested in solar. You're already working at energy savings and reducing your carbon footprint. I actually don't think that's the case. I think there's only two of us that have invested in solar in this room, and that's Councillor Vandervis and myself. We spent several thousands of dollars.
Can I make a point here that you're actually speaking from ignorance and you don't know the answer to your question? You're making an assertion that you can't possibly back up.
I've actually asked the question previously in council, so unless something's changed in the last 2 years, I'd be surprised. So I will.
Well, it may surprise you to know that I've had solar on my roof for over 20 years. So what I'm saying is you're making assertions that you are ignorant of.
I acknowledge that, Your Worship. I would like to see then all councillors that are supporting this to invest in solar and put their own money in the industry. The part that I'm really concerned about is how this is going to affect our farming industry, our community. I will continue to support the livability of our city and even better see Dunedin GDP's growth and contribute more to the economy. I see this motion as threatening a number of key aspects of our city: the farming, the business, tourism, even education, with thousands of students that regularly travel in and out of our city. I will continue to support gas exploration off the coast of Otago, especially when it will be embraced by current coal users here in New Zealand and China. When you read the Chinese government is planning on allowing the development of 300 to 500 new coal power plants, That really concerns me. Personally, I believe we have a housing emergency that is more urgent and pressing to the residents of Dunedin. I look forward to all councillors who support a climate emergency to front up and declare what changes they are immediately going to make to reduce their carbon footprint.
Further speaker, Councillor Elder.
I've been doing a lot of thinking about this. And on a personal level, it's my birthday today, and my birthday present will be an electric bike. And it's been a journey for me as well, to be honest. And on a personal level, I think probably we all have changed when it comes to plastic bags, to using public transport, to many little things. I too have a concern about the words climate emergency just because of those who are vulnerable, and would like to see some comms, I suppose, around, more clear comms around that. In fact, I was asked recently by the residents of South Dunedin that there be a workshop explaining more clearly some comms around that, because the word emergency is alarmist, I suppose, and I look at, I suppose, Dave Cull's explanation of a slow-moving earthquake, and see that as a really good example of what we might use as in terms of an emergency, because in fact we do need to have to prepare for the future, and that is a certainty. So I will support this, but I do believe we need to unpack emergency and explain more clearly what we are doing and what that word means for our more vulnerable communities. Thank you.
Further speakers, Councillor Benson-Pope. Councillor Benson.
Thank you, Worship. I think we owe a considerable debt of gratitude to the people that came today. Pity some of them haven't stayed to see our sceptics and deniers out themselves, but that's their decision. And that's an irritation, I guess, for all of us. But I think Councillor O'Malley's, well, first of all, I'd like to thank Councillor Hawkins for the modification of the original motion. I think that's entirely appropriate and desirable. And I think Councillor O'Malley's analogy with the nuclear-free movement is apposite, because when communities, especially with wide community support, get together and state their views and convince councils who have been doing quite a lot, actually, as in our case, but not yet enough to do more, then it's harder for governments to do nothing, or it's harder for governments not to do enough either. And I speak from some experience in that respect, and I first of all want to apologise because I was one of the 3 New Zealand government delegates to the COP7 conference in Marrakesh in 2001, to my shame. And we were at a conference that coincided with the collapse of the Larsen B ice shelf, which was the first really big hunk of Antarctica to fall off, and led to all sorts of very dire predictions about accelerating loss of the sea ice and also the ice in the Arctic, all of which are coming true. That was far too long ago, and sadly, the only thing that's slower than the glacial political movement internationally to do something about this, the only thing that's slower than the increasing sea level rise is the lack of action politically internationally. I have to say this, but guess what? Smoking causes cancer. And for a long time, people believed the counter-arguments funded by big business and vested interest. And this issue is no different. It's extraordinary, and I find it amazingly frustrating that even those few of you who've remained today have seen that we've got one climate denier and a couple, 3 probably, people who would describe themselves as climate skeptics. How you can possibly stand up and argue the sort of lines that are being taken when you are the spokesman for Progress Otago is a bit of a marvel. But I think we owe, as I said, a great debt of gratitude to the people who've been marching in the streets. I think it's a real shame that we are dropping so much responsibility onto generations other than our own, but I do know it's time to actually take some more radical action, and some of it's here. I have to say that I don't think we're being particularly insensitive if we do convince more people it's an emergency. I don't care whether you call it a crisis or an emergency, because it's sure as hell both, actually.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'd just like to thank the staff for preparing the report so that we could make a consideration and decision about this. I'd also like to acknowledge Councillor Hawkins and colleagues who have spoken in support of this. And for me, the key word is really not emergency, but quality and relationships. And for me, yes, I agree with Councillor Wiley, we do have a housing emergency, but we have this Mother Earth fighting back, if you like, against our centuries of abuse, is basically a challenge to us and a test of our collective, not our personal, our collective willingness to collaborate and work together on solutions. And not to argue about the quality of the problem. And so for me, Mother Earth, Papatuanuku, whomever you call her, is actually testing us to actually come together and get over our little foibles and actually think about the threat of the survival, not only of the human species, but also all other species on the planet. So. And I would just like to acknowledge that, you know, since colonisation, since Christopher Columbus took a trip across the Atlantic in 1492, the threat of survival of Indigenous peoples has always been imperilled. And so this puts us together. We're all in it together, and we need to actually work together and actually make genuine relationships that heal ourselves, our societies, our communities, our whānau, and our planet. Kia ora.
For my part, I'll be supporting this motion. In considering it, as I was reading the papers, I was concerned that, again, it was a very aspirational decision. And one of the things that's been made clear to me recently has been that many in our community, particularly young people, are asking for more action. They're not satisfied with pious statements of aspiration. And it begs the question, of course, are we doing enough? And I think if you took the scientific consensus of, say, 5 years ago, we probably were, we thought. But the thing that's changing is the scientific consensus. And that is it's rapidly deteriorating. And one or two speakers have mentioned that there's been fairly consistent sea level rise over a century or so. That's true, but the point that the scientists are pointing out is it's very, very likely to accelerate. And so the first reason that I think that I'm supporting this is that predicted acceleration or deterioration to a point, as Councillor O'Malley made, of no return. And after that, there is no going back. It doesn't matter what we do. I think the second, and I agree with those who have made the comment that this will involve comprehensive change in virtually everything we do. You bet it will. We better get on with it, because it will involve comprehensive change of everything we do. That's the first reason that I've supported this. The second reason is about youth. Someone made the comment to me the other day that as decision makers, If the timeline for the realisation of our decision is beyond our lifetime, we shouldn't be making it. We should be leaving it to people who are younger than us, because it's them that are going to be affected. And I reflected on that and felt that it was a very valid point, and that the people with more future to be concerned about have a right to be listened to, perhaps more than those of us who are more geriatric. So I really do support this, because even though it appears to be aspirational, as Councillor Hawkins said, it is a catalyst for more urgent action, and the action is going to be absolutely essential. A couple of points have been made by some speakers. One, I think Councillor Van Ivers asked the question, is there anything that this council can do that will make a difference? Well, that's a rationalisation for inaction, because you could ask that of any particular council, and if you isolate each one, of course the effect is going to be relatively minimal. The point is, everybody has to be doing something. It's a pretty inane kind of conclusion to draw anyway. And another councillor has asked what the cost to council would be. Well, I think that just begs the question. The cost to council is not what we do. The cost to council will be if we don't do anything. Councillor Hawkins, your right of reply.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. And seeing as the PR industry has been raised, I think that's a useful comment to make. Some time ago, the last 5 or 10 years ago, the debate was about whether or not climate change was happening, or whether it was man-made or not. And the smarter ones, with the vested interests in maintaining the status quo, quickly moved on, and rather than arguing that it wasn't happening and that we weren't causing it, it was that, yes, it's a serious issue, and yes, we did cause it, but we're doing just enough, thank you, and maybe technology will fix it some point down the line, and I'm so pleased to see such a fantastic example of Mr. Gotcha in the wild, that if we all just made personal decisions about the shoes we wore, or our mode of transport, or how we chose to spend our holidays, then that would address the problem. But that isn't going to solve a problem, even if everybody had equal access to all of those solutions at an individual level, which they don't. Even if they did, that isn't going to address something on this scale. You need systemic and structural change to address this. And I thank Councillor O'Malley for articulating the science better than I ever will do in a month of Sundays, because that is always useful context to have in this discussion. The problem science has is a communication problem, but that's something that we also collectively need to address also. Councillor Van der Vis asked, what is it that we can do, what can this council do to affect it, almost as if we don't govern the transport system, that we don't manage land use, that we don't deal with town planning, that we don't manage the waste system. All things that can, if managed with a more future-focused perspective, contribute to reducing our carbon footprint. And then at a national level, you know, New Zealand's too small, India and China, etc., etc. If every country the size of New Zealand decided it was too small to do anything, that's about a quarter of the world's carbon footprint, and that is a significant contribution to make. So the idea that we are too small to make a difference is disappointing. To dwell not too lengthily on Councillor Newell's tumour analogy, this isn't about saving the planet, because the planet's going to be just fine. This is about saving ourselves, and self-interest, generally speaking, is something that we as a species are quite good at, but in this case that seems to be a difficult bridge for us to cross, but this is a world that's full of cognitive dissonance from time to time. The point's been made. I mean, the sea level rise is obviously a concern, but it is just one symptom of this problem. An unstable climate delivers us any number of challenges, whether they're floods or droughts or other things that the Oxford Dictionary might define it as an emergency. And those are the things on the way through as the seas rise incrementally or exponentially or whatever, that we are already dealing with and will continue to deal with increasing frequency and intensity, particularly if we don't make the kinds of investments, if you like, locally, nationally and internationally to get us on the right track over the next 10 years or so. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to put this and we'll do it by the...
Councillor Benson Pope. Councillor Elder. Councillor Gary.
Aye.
Councillor Hall. Councillor Hawkins.
Aye.
Councillor Lefiso.
Aye.
Councillor Lord.
No.
Councillor Newell.
Aye.
Councillor O'Malley.
Aye.
Councillor Steedman.
No.
Councillor Vandervis.
No.
Councillor Wiley.
No.
Councillor Wilson.
Aye.
Your Worship.
Yes.
Carried 9-5.
Thank you, that's carried. Now I'm going to, given the time, and we'll be going since 1 o'clock, I'm going to move that we have a brief break, 10 minutes. So I'll move from the chair that we do. Second to Councillor Wilson. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. We'll be back here at 5 to 4. Okay, councillors, we'll move on to item 18, which is the LGNZ Annual General Meeting Remits and Rules. Now, just to give some context to this, first of all, there's about 24 of these remits, and then there's the rules, or that might include the rules. But anyway, there's more than a score. And the process at the AGM will be that the delegates of all of the councils will be there and eligible to vote. And each of the remits is spoken to, or the right to speak to them is given to the people, the councils that have moved to proposed the remits. So the delegates from Dunedin, or from every council for that matter, will hear arguments from the speakers that we won't hear here. We've got material in front of us, but we won't hear that. So I'm loath to, and I'm not one of them, by the way. I'm chairing the meeting in my role as president, so that's why the presiding candidates will probably be Councillor Staines and there's Councillor Hawkins and Councillor Gary as well. So I'm loath to bind our delegates too much, but I suggest that we go through these, and if there are any, what I'm suggesting is that we basically, they're all relatively worthy, with one or two exceptions, worthy causes. And I'm suggesting that in the main we leave it to our delegates on the day. But if there are any that anyone is really opposed to, that I think we should bring them up and debate those. Or in favour of, particularly, then bring them up and we'll discuss those. But clearly, with 24, if we debate them all here, first of all, we won't have time to do it. And secondly, it would, I think, unnecessarily bind our delegates in the absence of complete knowledge of the arguments around some of them anyway. Councillor Benson Pope.
Well, I was just going to suggest that, would you like me to move that we give our delegates mandate to make the decision subsequent to the discussion, yes, except for any that are flagged now where we make a decision?
Yeah. So that's right, if you're moving that.
Yeah.
So second that?
I won't second that.
Well, second that, Councillor Hall? Yep. So just to make that clear again, the resolution that has been proposed is that we give our delegates the mandate to make the call, having heard the arguments at the AGM, except for any that are brought up here and voted on separately, if people have particularly strong views on them, and they will be subject to a majority vote here. Are there any other speakers to that? It's been moved and seconded. If there are none, I'll... Yes, speak.
I'm unsure of the process. Is this the point where I flag something that I think we should take a position on?
No, not yet.
You're doing that separately? Okay,
yep,
sorry.
We're doing that separately so that everyone will have an opportunity to raise any of these particular remits that exercise in particularly. Would you like to speak to it? the resolution.
I just want some clarity, if I could, for Councillor Hawkins and I. Should we sit back from the vote, or should we participate in this vote?
No,
You'll find a vote.
Okay, if there's no further speakers, I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Now, can I ask for any particular remits that, or rule changes that councillors want, that feel very strongly about? Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you. I would encourage council to vote against remit 22 from Whanganui District Council that calls for the national centralisation of appointment of independent RMA commissioners to hear consent hearings.
Okay. Is there a seconder for that? Councillor Lord. Okay. Do you wish to speak further to it, Councillor Hawkins? Or I can put it straight to the vote, or does anyone else wish to speak to that? Okay, I'm going to put it to the vote. All those in favour of voting against that particular remit, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? That's carried. So we'll note that one. Are there any others that people... Councillor Vandevers.
I was just hoping to have a bit of clarification on remit number 11, that LGNZ investigate the ability of the sector to collaborate in procuring open source designs and plans for bulk infrastructure that are largely similar. Can someone explain to me what that is?
Okay.
Open source designs, I thought they were available anyway, if they're open sourse.
Within the limits of my understanding of it myself, I will try and explain that. I think, I'll give an example. There have been cases, there was a case in the North Island a few years ago where a community was considering a new wastewater plant, and they got in costs. It was astronomical. It's a pretty small council. And then at that stage, they changed their engineer, and they got an engineer from Southern Africa who had some experience of wastewater plants in somewhat more demanding situations. And he ended up designing a plant which they subsequently built for about a quarter the price that they had originally been quoted. But, and that was fine, still working, everyone's happy with it. But when asked later, did any other council come to them and say, well, how did you do that? He said, no one called, because they didn't know about it. And so I think what's being referred to here, and I'm open to correction if I'm is making those sorts of designs or whatever more widely available so that other councils can get the benefit and utilise them, that effectively making them open source.
Is the intention just to put them on a website, in fact?
Look, I don't know. I can, because I didn't move it.
If that's the case, then absolutely fine. Sorry, other
It's
questions?
to do joint procurement of something that probably is not open source at this time, but at the point at which you collaborate to purchase it, you make it clear to the providers that you are then going to make the details available to the entire local government sector so that other people are able to access it more cheaply, and so you need to know it's there.
If that's what it means, I'm entirely happy. Remit number 8, weed control. Consider using environmentally friendly weed control methods. I know some people think that glyphosate is environmentally friendly. I take it this doesn't allow for glyphosate.
I can't be absolutely sure, but given where that came from, I would be almost certain that it did include glyphosate, not as being non-environmentally friendly.
Right. So okay. No, that's all fine. Thank you.
Oh, and I think the Chief's just pointed out they're probably also referring to those herbicides that also kill bees. Councillor Elder.
I just want to support remit 21, museums and galleries, because in fact Otago was one of the first early museums, and as such holds a significant amount of nationally significant collections and serves the whole of the Otago area. And I believe that indeed there should be central government funding on
Right.
an annual basis.
Well,
and
look,
I want us to emphasise that.
yes, councillor, we could vote on that, but given that this council has already approached the government demanding exactly this, I would be most surprised if our delegates didn't vote for it. But Councillor Hawkins, you may have a comment.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with everything that Councillor Elder just said, except that the remit as drafted specifically mentions funding for museums and galleries that are operated by local authorities, and the Otago Museum is not operated by a local authority. I've made contact with Mayor McDougall and Whanganui to see if they would entertain an amendment to that remit to include those that are substantively funded by local authorities, which then would include that. And I mean, that hasn't been resolved, but I'm happy to get the feeling from, I assume that council would be supportive of that should it come to pass. I wouldn't vote against the remit because obviously the DPAG and Toitu would be qualifying institutions, but it would be helpful for the museum to be able to broaden that out.
Well, I think that speaking as the chair of the AGM, I can assure you that the opportunity to ask for an amendment, assuming it's within the rules, will be available. Councillor O'Malley.
Just to that point too, the list does include the Dunedin Public Art Gallery as an example, but it doesn't include Toitu, does it? So I know that it's only an example list, but it'd be quite good to make sure our institutions get on it.
So are there any other of the remits or the rule changes that are particularly concerning anybody? Councillor Wilson.
I'm very supportive, and I'm sure that this will go through anyways, Remit 16 with Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act. I didn't get to sit on that, but I'm just wondering whether that again should be one that we should include the LAP process, because I think every council has found it exceedingly infuriating. So extend the remit to include the local authority. LAP, what does it say?
Is the
I think that's what it's referring to.
Yeah, that's in the Sale and Supply of Liquor Act, so the review is automatically about that, and it's saying involve local government in that review.
Okay, it's the EG.
So I think it's going to do
EGs.
exactly what you want.
Yeah, it's not in the EGs.
Councillor Gary.
Your Worship, I've just got a question for clarification, if that's acceptable to you.
Yeah, sure.
So it's one of the rule changes, and it's number 2, E11B. I just wanted to clarify, this is around appointments to National Council to ensure diversity of representation. Any such person must be an elected member. So would that include community board a member, for example, from CBEC that could be appointed?
Sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I'm just thinking about, well, I don't, councils nominate people for, within their zone or within their sector to be representatives on National Council, and it's the zone or the sector that vote on it. Now, I don't know whether councils can nominate community board members to be representatives or not. That's what I don't know.
I was going to the earlier one, which says a person holding office as a member of a community board within the district of a member authority is the definition now, the new definition of elected member. That was what sort of tipped me off to the possibility that may be the case.
I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you.
I should know that. Any further? Well, then that stands. I don't think we need to vote on. Oh, yes, we did. We've already voted on it. So the first resolution stands, and the exception has been the one on. Remind me. Yeah, RMA hearings, and that's been voted on. So the presiding delegates now have their writing instructions.
And the amendment to the museum one.
Oh yes, and but
that's happening.
That
That's
will need to be
underway.
taken up at the AGM. I better swat up the rules before I preside over that. That's a good case. I'm seen as favouring the local team. Right. Sorry. Not sure they see it that way in Wellington. Okay, on to item 19, Waipori Fund Statement of Investment Policies and Objectives. Can I invite Mr Toombs and Mr Davey to join us? Now, is there anything you wish to introduce this with, or do you want to just go straight into questions? You're quite straight in. Councillors, Councillor Wiley.
Thank you, Your Worship. Mr Toombs, I'm just wanting clarification on discussion, second point, move 2 areas of responsibility from Dunedin DCTL to Council to reflect the Council appoints and manages the fund manager. And I'm just, what would be the purpose of that, and positives or negatives of us, Council, doing that, and why the change?
Yeah, thank you. I think it was just correcting something that wasn't quite clear in the earlier version, as opposed to us actually changing anything. DCTL does act as the fund manager, so why there were 2 sections in the earlier SIPO that had different responsibilities for either, I'm not sure.
That's right, we made the change a while back, but we didn't make it in here. So this wasn't reflecting actual practice on the ground after we made the change a while back.
Okay, so, and again, just getting clarity in my mind, does that mean that that comes through this table on who we appoint as the fund managers, and if we make changes in that sense?
I'm saying yes. At the moment, all of our investment decisions go through Treasury with DCTL. If we wanted to bypass that, we'd certainly come back here, yes.
So is this bypassing that?
No.
Okay, that's retaining the going through the Treasury.
This is reinforcing it.
Okay, that's what I wanted the clarity on. Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Any further questions? Councillor Vandervis.
Page 140, we've got to determine a mandate provided to the fund managers, which will include, but it's not necessarily restricted to, and we've got the addition of the allowable allocation to various categories of investment, such as equities or fixed interest. Sorry, this is on our page.
Oh, yeah. Sorry,
140.
yeah.
Okay, this seems to be a new area that we're allowing managers to get into. Does it include investing in derivatives?
Am I on? So the new bullet points at the bottom of the section headed the council.
Under governance on page 140.
Yeah.
So it used to sit underneath the Dunedin City Treasury Limited, and now it sits with the council. It's been moved.
It's moved up,
you can see it's struck out further down the same page and moved up.
So it's the same thing, it's just been moved up?
Yeah.
Sorry, I couldn't read the struck out, it's too small, but thank you for letting me know. Cheers.
Further questions?
Actually, the question actually was at the end is, are we or have we, given that it's not a change, but have we been investing in derivatives as well as equities?
No.
Thank you.
Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. On page 133, point 9, the proposed change to section 5 of the SIPO clarifies the fund can lend to council and its related entities. Can you give an example of how that may look, or what that could entail?
Trying to find which page 10 of the SIPO is. Sorry. Okay, so basically the same. Sorry, Councillor, I've now just found out where we are. Can you just repeat your question, please?
So we've got a question at paragraph 9. Can you give me an example of what that may look like? That the fund can lend to council and its related entities. So can you give me an example of how you think that may work at some point?
Yes, so say take one of the CCOs. At the moment, Treasury borrows money from, say, a commercial bank. What we might choose to do is to borrow the money from the Waipori Fund. I think that ability has always been there, but it's never been actually clarified. So this is a clarification.
All right, no further questions? All right, would someone like to move the resolution on the order paper? Councillor Hall, second to Councillor Lord. Do you wish to, either of you wish to speak to it?
I would just say that just in relation to what Councillor Wiley was just asking about, that's something we've been asking for quite some time, because it gives us the ability to borrow, loan. So, for example, if you want to borrow from the bank, it's reasonably cheap, cheapest it's been in years. If you want to invest in the bank, which, say, for example, we would do with cash, you would get a very poor return. So it's actually just bypass that. So you could say.
You wish to speak to the resolution? No. No. Does anyone else wish to speak? And just to clarify, it is approves the revised statement of investment policy because there's been no amendments around the table. So if there's no further speakers, I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Okay. Thank you. Item 20. 2019-20 statements of intent. Can I invite Mr. Cooper and Ms. Adams to join us for DCHL? Welcome. Keith. By way of introduction.
Okay, obviously this is the accumulation in a relatively robust process. We've been to and from councillors via workshops or via communications. So probably just to recap, when we last spoke to these SOIs in February, the SOI, draft SOIs we had from the companies were all based around last year's performance or last year's figures, given that they hadn't entered their own budget rounds for the 19-20 year. So they were more or less placeholders based on information they knew at the time. There's been subsequent events in City Forests and also Aurora, which means their final budgets, which have been incorporated into their final SOIs, have moved since the February figures, which has seen in the shorter term larger losses, but then a more robust turnaround in the third year, with the net result being an improved position over the 3 years compared to the provisional figures. That's also meant we've had, again, more robust data given the timeframes involved from the subsidiaries and of course from DCC itself in terms of debt profiles, which has now seen the total debt level in the 3-year period move out, but also the total has come forward. So that means we are looking to address that approximately a year earlier than had previously been envisaged. Again, timing from council and also Aurora's accelerated reinvestment program. City Forests has also had to adjust its accounting practices to fit with all of New Zealand's advice, which has seen their operating profit decrease, but that's been reversed through their certain asset revaluations, with the net result being much the same. There's various points of feedback that we've given DCC as the shareholder, which we've attempted to answer them through points 10 to 14, which I assume we can take as read, but happy to take any questions on them. So other than that, it's been we're happy with the process. We're happy that we've got there in the end. We're not happy with necessarily the results, but the reasons for some of those poorer results, particularly in Aurora, have been well traversed. Happy to take any questions.
Questions, Councillor? Councillor Gary and then Councillor Vandervis.
Thank you, Mr Cooper and Ms Adams. Just on the section entitled Shareholder Feedback, there was a couple of things I would really appreciate some clarification on. The first one was item 11, and I just wondered if you could expand on that a little.
The Crown, in terms of DIL, didn't support that. They default to what is central government policy at the time, and unless it fits with that, they don't take a view on it, they just decline to support it. It's largely a bit moot, however, because DIL doesn't pay anybody below the living wage level anyway. And we're still working with some of the other companies on what the implications of it would be from a profit perspective.
Thank you, and I'm not so worried about it not being in the annual report. I was more interested in the proportion of staff, so that's good news. And 13, the additional commentary on the company's approach to director appointment and the approach to governance section, and on page 237, I just wanted to check with you and clarify, this includes giving consideration to a range of factors, including demographic diversity. Could you just explain demographic diversity for me and what you understand it to be?
It was perhaps an attempt to avoid focusing on one form of diversity. So it's a broader term to say we're embracing all forms of diversity, probably specifically not focusing on any one part of diversity or one definition of diversity.
Thank you.
Councillor Vandervis and then Councillor O'Malley. Oh, sorry, Councillor Lord.
You've said that the next 2 years are not looking too flash, but that you're getting better information now and that the third year is looking better. I've been here probably too many years, and each one of them has had worse and then worse news coming out of Aurora. And here we have it again with, it looks like over the next 2 years, a loss of $33 million that's budgeted. Given that the losses have, and the estimates of the need to spend at Aurora have kept going up, and the losses have kept going up as well, do you accept that 3 years out from now is likely to be less robust than 2 years out or 1 year out from now? Because every year we get essentially worse news. I mean, you've given us some hope that the 3 years is looking better, but given the trend that we've experienced for a long time now, how robust can that 3 year hope be, especially considering we haven't had Commerce Commission decisions yet, and there's a whole lot of other information which I've been asking for months now that Aurora have failed to supply regarding the accelerated pole replacement program.
Okay, there's no quick or singular answer to that. Based on the information that the company has to hand at present, these forecasts are robust. However, it's a particularly moving environment in that when they did the original forecasts in February, that hadn't given them time to embrace the 2 Commerce Commission's reviews, which they've now embraced, and that's had an impact on their asset management plan, which has resulted in an acceleration of some of the work as a result of those 2 reviews. Since that, however, they've now been subject to the Commerce Commission release of some 2 weeks ago of the DPP, the price policy for the next 3 years, which they're now contesting, as are some other lines companies, based on the formula that the Commerce Commission's applied. So
is that the 9% that they've allowed?
That's the draft decision. So we're yet to contest that. The key issue with that is the long-range nature of averaging CapEx, whereas we're saying we've got a short-term problem. So we are contesting that, which may or may not have a positive or negative impact. Then beyond that, that last 1 year, then beyond that we would ideally like to think the CPP would kick in for the last year of this period, and that's yet to be negotiated with the Commerce Commission. So we're comfortable that it's robust based on the parameters that they currently know, but to be frank, it's clearly, if it stays as is, that would be a good coincidence relying on Commerce Commission agreeing with our assumptions.
Right, the 9% that's draft currently, what was applied for? What was the increase that you were hoping for?
I don't think we were hoping for anything necessarily. We were awaiting the Commerce Commission draft outcome. So,
but you must have applied for a significant increase in order to cover a lot of these costs.
There were more placeholders, to be fair. And there's so many moving parts that it's hard to unpick the impact. The biggest impact, however, was on the allowance they made for averaging CapEx over, I think it was 9 years, as opposed to the shorter period, which we were hoping for it to be in the last 5-year period, which is when we've had a significant increase in expenditure.
Okay, thank you for that. Regarding my other part of the question, why is it that after many, many weeks of applying to see the reports from your accelerated program manager, Mr. Brosnan, why is it that I still haven't been able to see them?
We believe we're still within the timelines that we agreed, which mimic the Lagoima process, and they expire next week, and we're currently working with Aurora to get those responses to you.
Councillor Lord.
Yeah, Keith, look, I just wanted to ask a question. We have focused a wee bit on the fact that there's increased debt. Now, where has our equity gone at the same time? Have we had an increase over that time? And what would the expected dollar value of increase in the companies be, if any? Do you know that?
Our overall group equity position has, I think it's decreased slightly from the figures we saw, but not materially. Some of them have been up and down. Clearly Aurora's down, but others have gone up. Valuation-wise, we did some work from memory last year, which updated the Murray & Co valuations, which showed they had improved. And obviously we would expect the valuations to improve, with the exception of we don't know about Aurora yet because Aurora is so dependent on the regulator's profitability allowance or revenue allowance. So I would say we would still be reliant on the work we did last year of the company's valuations. There's nothing that we're aware of that would see them go down either.
No, that probably wasn't quite what I meant. What I meant was at the time, in say 2 years' time, when we've had a loss for what Councillor Vandevers was referring to with the DCHL, where would you expect the value of our companies and that to be overall then? Would that be increased? Will the money we're spending...
absolutely, because then Aurora particularly be valued on a known earnings capacity.
But you don't know what that figure would be?
I wouldn't say we've got no idea, but we equally wouldn't want to guess a figure at this point.
Councillor O'Malley.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. I'm going back to point 11 again. I'm just trying to understand the English of this around the SOIs and the proportion of staff receiving a living wage. Did you say that Treasury basically had no opinion?
No, when they look at the SOIs that we put forward, or the company puts forward, then we give feedback on. They have, given that we're co-shareholders, they have the right to look at what we're requesting and decline or accept it, and they generally default to central government policy whether they accept, as opposed to having an opinion and embracing what our suggestions are, unless they're largely mechanical. But policy-wise, it's got to be aligned with central government policy for them to accept it.
So, in other words, it wasn't aligned with central government policy to declare the percentage of your staff that are not on living wage?
It was more pointing towards that there was no policy necessarily on having people achieve the minimum wage, living wage. Sorry.
But the statements to report the proportion that are, as opposed to a policy of moving towards it. And as you said, Dunedin Airport is 100%.
can't see into what the reasons they just declined, because they didn't have a reference point from a policy perspective.
Okay, cool. And what about the SOIs of companies managed by staff employed by DCC? What was the underlying thinking there?
So the DCHL, DSPL and DCTL are all staffed by employees of DCC, so our data is captured in DCC reporting and things, but again...
Okay, so that's the reason, it's because it's captured in another place, as opposed to we didn't...
Yeah, and staff, that's right, and staff aren't employed by those companies, so their data wouldn't be reported in their annual
very good.
reports.
Okay, that makes more sense. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Elder.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question. In the statement of intent, there was mooted that we were proactive in using the opportunities that are provided through huge upgrade in infrastructure to develop and continue youth training. And I was just wondering what your feedback on that is for the companies and what they're doing in that area.
Yes, so I believe Delta's statement of intent will note that they target 20 apprenticeships per annum. So Delta is certainly the company that's most suited to youth training and trades training. But I think we did also note in the shareholder, when we negotiated with Council on what feedback you'd like to provide to the companies, we noted that we would include in their letter of expectation, which goes out to them in 3 or 4 months' time, that we expect them to seek out opportunities for youth skills development. So it's a letter of expectation rather than in the statement of intent process.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to clarify that.
Councillor Van der Vis.
Under financial forecasts on page 6, I'm going back to Councillor Lord's question. At the top it says shareholders' funds to total assets, 23% going down to 21% and 21% for the next 2 years. Does that give some answer or some comfort to Councillor Lord? Could you explain the shareholders' funds to total assets dropping from 23 to 21% over the next few years?
It is a slightly different question. I think Councillor Law was referring to the value of the companies, which is normally attributed to the equity position. This probably reflects the debt profile more importantly, and it starts to, post-2022, you'll see a reversal of that as the debt starts to decrease on the back of earnings. So there's a timing issue here. If we were to run this out further, you would see a bit of a hockey stick approach to that.
And when do you see that changing significantly? Which year after 22?
2022 would be the first year of the CPP, whatever it's reset at, and again it's placeholder country. And we also start to, in 2025 from memory, we would start to see a lessening of the upfront capital expenditure costs at Aurora.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Okay, would someone like to move the resolution on the paper? Councillor Lord, second to Councillor Hawkins. Councillor Lord, do you wish to speak to it? Any other speakers? Councillor Van der Vis.
This is one of the most worrying papers I think I've seen, and we've seen a number of them, especially regarding Aurora. I remember, not that distinctly because it's a few years ago now, that the issue of deferred maintenance in Aurora and having to spend maybe $200 or $300 million to fix it came up. And then an ex-Aurora employee, Mr. Healy, came along and said, no, it's going to be far more than that. And figures of sort of 600 and 700 and then 750 million were mentioned. And then Mr. Healy came along and said, no, you're going to have to spend even more than that. It's $1 billion problem. And the paperwork that we've had and the assurances that we've had about the pole replacement program, every year that we've had this paperwork, it's simply become a bigger and bigger, and it seems to me, unaddressed problem. We've got no dividends coming for 3 years. We've got losses in Aurora of 33.8 million. We've got losses across DCHL of 24 million and nothing coming from it. If the DCC wasn't basically ratepayer funded and we were shareholders looking for a return on our investment, surely long before now, in the real business world, we would have either sold off Aurora as a liability, or we would have drastically changed the model of the company. I know we had a bit of a reshuffle of directors, but all I've seen in the figures is them all heading south inexorably, and these figures are heading south even worse. What should we do as the ratepayers' representative to try and stem the bleeding from these council-controlled companies, which to me just seem to be out of control? Is there anything that we as a council can actually do in order to prevent these massive losses continuing? Or do you think it's simply a matter of 20 years where deferred maintenance was indulged in, and we are now just having to bite the bullet? I think it's completely unacceptable that we've got to this point. I think that it's an awful thing for the new council to have to try and deal with, companies not giving a dividend, bigger debts, bigger problems with the Commerce Commission. All of these are issues which should have been faced and haven't been for many years now. And I just find it incredibly depressing that we have to keep getting these kind of figures put in front of us. Thank you.
Further speakers? There are none. I'll put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Well, just process-wise, I can just forget the vote. You speak.
Okay, yeah, look, all I was just going to reply to that is I can't do anything about 20 years of underinvestment that started in 1989 or whatever, but I think that what we can do is address the problem and fix the problem, and that is what we've done. And it does cost money to fix things, just like it costs money to invest in infrastructure and other types of things. But the reality of it is that I believe this company will be in a far better position in the future. It will return to paying dividends, and also this city will also be in a better place because of that. So.
Right, I'll put it again, and you're entitled to take into account what Councillor Lord has said in his right of reply. All those in favour, please say aye.
Division, please.
Division.
Councillor Benson-Pope. Yes. Councillor Elder. Yes. Councillor Gary.
Yes.
Councillor Hall. Yes. Councillor Hawkins.
Aye.
Councillor Lefiso. Aye. Councillor Lord.
Aye.
Councillor Newell.
Aye.
Councillor O'Malley.
Aye.
Councillor Steedman.
Yes.
Councillor Vandervis.
No.
Councillor Wiley.
Yes.
Councillor Wilson.
Yes.
Your Worship.
Yes.
Carried 13-1.
It's carried. Right. We'll move on to item 21, which is a notice of motion. Councillor Elder, this is your notice of motion. Is there a seconder? Seconder for this motion? Oh, Councillor O'Malley. Okay. Can I ask you to speak to it, Councillor Elder?
I would note today that in today's ODT there are no specific plans to give contracts to hillside workshops. Today I'm putting a motion actually for the South Dunedin Business Association. They have asked me to put forward this motion. Why? Because in the past hillside workshops has been the beating heart of South Dunedin, providing well-paid jobs and generating income and spending in the area. There are other reasons for putting this forward. Because over recent years, our trade skills, engineering and foundry workers have lost many jobs, and in lobbying for more contracts, we are also lobbying for keeping and growing jobs in our engineering workforce. And also because it will support our local engineering firms as they endeavour to build an engineering hub in Dunedin, and that we work together and grow the capacity of many of our firms, for they will benefit from contracts being subcontracted out to them, especially those with specialty areas of expertise, including ferry engineering, Kamahi electronics, etc., who will get subcontracts under this. So that's why I'm supporting this, because in fact I believe we need to be supporting hillside engineering workshops to build in their capacity and create jobs for the engineering workforce of this city. Thank you.
Councillor O'Malley.
I'm happy to second this and support it. I think the reason I'd like this brought to Kiwi Rail's attention is an activity I would call administrative indifference. The Lower South Island, Dunedin in particular, is not often on the radar of decision-making purposes or the allocation of resources, and it's hurting us quite badly. The reality of it is we have an extremely good workshop there with a good workforce, and if the government is really taking regional development seriously, and this main centre, I do remind the government again, then Kiwi Rail needs to also be part of that and needs to make sure that it brings work to us, because we can execute it in this area, and please don't dismiss us without considering us. Thank you.
Further speakers? Well, for my part, I can support this. This is consistent with some efforts that we made probably 8 years ago now, when Kiwi Rail was looking at building new or procuring new locomotives and new rolling stock, and we put quite a lot of effort in from Council's point of view. I can recall having conversations with Spanish railway purveyors and various other people in an effort to get some of the work brought to Hillside, even if it was some not entire rolling stock, but for other stuff. So this is consistent with that and our efforts to get to utilise our workforce and to bring work to Hillside. So I'm in support. If there are no further speakers, I'll invite Councillor Elder to exercise the right of reply.
As our recent trip to Bison Jacks demonstrates, we have all the skills here in Dunedin to invent, develop and manufacture high-class engineering products. We have an ecosystem to support this with Kamahi Electronics, Farah Engineering, JTech Injection Moulding and all the other ecosystems around Dunedin that support, in fact, Bison's production of those lifts that they're producing. So I believe that in advocating and supporting role for lobbying for Kiwi Rail contracts, we're actually supporting a larger ecosystem that we need to grow, because in fact, if we don't grow it, we lose, as we know, those skills and abilities and trades that we held dear for many years, and I just see this as an opportunity to grow those. So that's why I support it.
Okay, I'm going to put it. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? It's carried. Thank you. Now, that's the end of the public part of the agenda. I'll move from the chair that the meeting move into confidential for the reasons outlined in the agenda. And further that Mr Cooper, Chairperson of Dunedin City Holdings, and Ms Adams, General Manager, DCHL, be permitted to attend to speak to item C4, Dunedin City Holdings Group appointments and reappointments, to provide assistance on that. I'll second Councillor Wilson. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. We'll give the team, the camera team, a bit of time to